The wilderness can be more terrifying than anything imagined, where silence hides unseen dangers and shadows move with purpose. From a northern expedition that vanished, leaving only a lone survivor with a chilling story to tell, to a lone climber on a remote northern face, feeling watched by an immense shadowy figure moving with impossible speed. In this video, you'll hear about 6 terrifying moments that test the limits of fear and survival. On October 14, 2019, a 6-person expedition set out into the northern wilderness of Manitoba, following an unmarked series of ridges deep inside the boreal forest where few had ever ventured. Their goal was to chart elevation data for a mapping project, documenting the untouched terrain before winter sealed it in snow. They were experienced and well-equipped, carrying satellite devices, thermal gear, and detailed route log. The team was led by Daniel Foster, 38, a field geologist known for his precision and composure, accompanied by cartographer Helen Ward, technician Luke Ramirez, and 3 graduate assistants, Jonas Bell, Carly Hughes, and Seth Monroe. For 2 days, everything went as planned. Then the 3rd night came, and nothing afterward could be explained by science or reason. When the helicopter pilot arrived at the designated extraction site the following morning, there was no signal, no response to repeated calls, and only a faint static through the radio. He followed the GPS coordinates back toward the last logged camp, and through the fog, saw that the tents had collapsed into the moss, their poles splintered and their fabric shredded. One figure was visible near the tree line, walking slowly in circles without shoes or pack, head lowered as if in a trance. That person was identified as Carly Hughes, the only survivor. She was barefoot, her clothing torn, her face scratched and pale, and she made no attempt to speak. Investigators reached the site within hours, recording one of the strangest and most disturbing scenes ever documented in that region. All 6 tents had been pulled down with uniform force, not torn at random as in a storm, but as though something immense had struck their centers simultaneously. Each personal item, sleeping bags, cooking pots, pack, had been arranged into a near-perfect circle, surrounding the center of the camp like a ritual or warning. There were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle beyond what appeared to be violent impacts on the ground, and no tracks from the missing members beyond a few disordered prints leading away for only a few meters before vanishing. What investigators did find, however, were enormous footprints unlike any known animal in the region. They were roughly human in shape but far broader, measuring close to 20 inches in length, spaced widely apart, pressed into the wet moss so deeply that some impressions had filled with groundwater. Around the perimeter of the clearing, several trees had been bent outward from the camp, the bark stripped in long vertical gouges reaching over 8 feet high, as though a tremendous force had swept through in every direction at once. Branches lay twisted and splintered, forming a chaotic ring that seemed unnatural in its precision. The forensic team concluded that whatever had occurred must have happened in an extremely short window of time. The distribution of disturbed ground suggested a rapid, violent event centered within a radius of about 20 meters. Blood was found on 2 tent zippers and along one flattened patch of moss, though the samples were limited and heavily diluted by moisture. No remains were ever recovered, and no clothing fragments or equipment belonging to the missing members were located beyond the immediate area. Even the food supplies, normally stored in sealed containers, had been removed and scattered in opposite directions far from the camp. Carly Hughes remained in hospital care for nearly 6 weeks, physically uninjured, apart from frostbite on her feet and shallow lacerations on her arm. She refused verbal communication, but responded to certain images during her evaluation. When shown sketches of bears, wolves, or humans, she remained still. When presented with an outline of a large bipedal shape, she trembled violently and turned her face away. The attending psychiatrist described her condition as a state of profound shock linked to overwhelming sensory trauma. Authorities initially proposed that a large bear, possibly a grizzly, displaced northward by seasonal patterns, had entered the camp, but no claw mark, paw prints, or bite traces were present. The spacing of the crushed vegetation suggested something that moved upright and at a speed that did not align with known bear behavior. A report noted that the destruction pattern was mechanical in precision and instantaneous in execution, as if the entire attack had occurred in under 4 minutes. No signs of firearms being discharged were found, though 2 rifles lay outside their cases, unfired, and one was bent near the barrel as if struck by tremendous force. Local search teams scoured the surrounding forest for weeks, using thermal drones and canine units, but the trail ended abruptly beyond the last footprint. Heavy rain followed days later, and when investigators returned, even those massive impressions had vanished. The area had taken on an eerie stillness, with birds absent and no animal tracks within 100 meters of the site. The moss had begun to regrow over the flattened ground, and the forest was slowly swallowing the circle where the packs once lay. No official explanation was released beyond unknown animal activity. The case was quietly closed the following spring. Privately, several members of the search unit admitted they had never seen damage like it, and one mentioned hearing low, rhythmic impacts echoing through the trees during the first night of the search, like heavy steps receding into the dark. Nothing was ever recorded. Years later, the area remains avoided by hunters and logging crews. The GPS tag of that camp no longer aligns with the current terrain, as though the forest itself had shifted. Some locals claim the ridge hides things that move only when no one is watching. Enormous shapes that cross silently between the trees. The official files sit archived under wildlife incident. On November 9, 2022, Daniel and Elise Crawford drove deep into the northern Idaho wilderness, following a narrow logging road that wound through dense forest and ended at a small hunting cabin built decades earlier near the base of the Selkirk Mountains. They had rented it for a long weekend to escape city noise and enjoy the quiet isolation of late autumn, when the air carried the scent of pine and frost, and the forest floor was already turning brittle beneath the first thin layer of ice. The cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by towering firs, its roof bowed slightly under the weight of damp leaves, its single chimney trailing a faint plume of smoke against the pale evening sky. They spent their first night peacefully enough, the silence outside broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the occasional rustle of wind brushing the trees. But just after midnight, Daniel woke to a hollow, deliberate sound, a knock, deep and slow, resonating through the walls as though from an open hand or a broad piece of wood striking the outer logs. 3 taps, then silent. Seconds later, 3 more echoed from the opposite wall. The rhythm was steady and unnerving, spaced perfectly, the way one might test the thickness of a surface rather than announce presence. He waited, listening to the small groans of the cabin, the faint hum of cooling embers. Then another sequence of knocks came, closer this time, from the wall near the door. Elise stirred, whispering his name, but he said nothing, staring toward the dark window framed in frost. There, for the briefest moment, a massive shape filled the glass. A figure tall and broad, shoulders stretching across the narrow pane, head slightly lowered, unmoving. It vanished almost instantly, leaving behind only the faint vibration of another knock on the far side of the building. When they finally gathered the courage to step outside, the cold bit sharply through their coat. The forest was still, the air heavy and dry, every sound absorbed by the frost-covered trees. They circled the cabin with a flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the fog that hung near the ground, but found no track, no sign of anyone nearby. The firewood stack, however, appeared disturbed, a few pieces scattered on the ground as though recently handled. Daniel dismissed it as wind or an animal and locked the door again, though the rhythmic knocking continued faintly until dawn, sometimes so soft it blended with the creaks of the structure, sometimes so loud it seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. By morning, frost covered everything in a thin, glassy sheen. As the light grew stronger, Daniel noticed a trail of impressions around the clearing, large, barefoot prints pressed deep into the frozen ground, far too long to belong to a human. Each step sank several inches into the hardened frost, and the stride length suggested something enormous had circled the cabin multiple times during the night. The firewood, once stacked neatly beside the port, was now arranged into a perfect circle on the ground, each log placed end to end as if laid with intent. Elise said nothing, but her face had turned pale, her breath visible in short, sharp bursts. They tried to rationalize it, perhaps someone playing a cruel joke, or an animal they could not identify. But the feeling that they were being watched never faded. That night, they kept the lantern burning and sat awake, listening. Just after midnight, the knocks began again. 3 on the west wall, 3 on the east. The intervals were precise, mechanical. Then the sound shifted to the roof. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving slowly from one side to the other. Dust drifted from the rafters, and the boards creaked under immense weight. A foul, musky odor seeped through the cracks in the wood, thick and damp like decayed vegetation mixed with animal musk. When Daniel opened the front door suddenly, the night air rushed in, but nothing stood there. The forest was silent, almost hollow, the moonlight filtering weakly through bare branches. No sound followed him back inside, yet the pressure of being observed was unbearable, an invisible gaze that pressed from every direction. He sealed the door and wedged the heavy table against it, though the knocks resumed moments later, now from directly behind the stove, as if something immense stood inches from the outer wall. The final night was the worst. The knocking never stopped. It moved in pattern, wall to wall, then from the window, then back to the roof. The sound was neither frantic nor random, but measured, as if the intruder understood the cabin's layout and was deliberately testing their reaction. Elise sat clutching her knees near the stove, shaking uncontrollably, her eyes fixed on the door. Daniel watched the clock hands crawl toward dawn, his pulse quickening each time the sound paused, expecting the next impact to come from within. At first light they fled. The forest seemed almost relieved to let them go, mist lifting from the trees as they drove down the narrow track toward the main road. They did not speak, both knowing there was nothing to explain that could make sense. Later that week, 2 local hunters who maintained the cabin during winter repairs hiked up to inspect it. They found no footprint. The frost had melted and refrozen, but the doorframe bore long parallel gouges stretching more than 8 feet above the threshold, deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath. The firewood circle remained exactly as described, untouched by wind or animals, each log still aligned in its precise arrangement. Inside, the scent of damp earth lingered heavily despite the cold air. The hunters reported their findings to the ranger station, where the details were entered as unknown disturbance. The official assumption was vandalism or a prank, though no tire marks or signs of intrusion were found on the approach road. The file was later closed without further action. Still, locals avoided the cabin afterward. Some said they had heard the same deliberate knocking while camping miles away. 3 slow taps, then silence, then 3 more, always evenly spaced, always answered from the opposite side of the dark. On August 17, 2017, 3 fishermen, Paul Reiner, Thomas Kovac, and Evan Mills, paddled down a narrow branch of the Clearwater River in northern British Columbia, seeking a quiet stretch of water where they could set their traps away from the crowded summer spots. The area was known for its isolation, the river curling between high banks of spruce and alder before widening into a slow, reflective channel. They camped near a gravel bar, where the only sounds were the flowing current and the distant call of loons echoing through the dusk. By late evening, their traps were set in neat intervals along the river bend, baited and anchored, ready for the morning check. The night was cold for August, the air damp and heavy, the water black beneath the fading light. The men stayed close to the fire until fatigue overtook them, and only the low hiss of the flames broke the stillness. Sometime after midnight, Tomas woke to the faint sound of splashing. It was rhythmic at first, like something large wading through shallow water, but then it stopped abruptly, followed by silence that seemed too deliberate. He assumed it was a moose crossing downstream and fell back asleep. At sunrise, they found the traps scattered. Some were overturned, others stacked. their positions too orderly to be random. Each row was evenly spaced along the riverbank, some traps filled with stones, others empty, aligned with mathematical precision as though arranged by an unseen hand cataloging objects by weight. The men stared in confusion, each row identical in distance and placement. Mud around the site was disturbed, and a strong, sharp, metallic, musky odor hung in the air, unlike anything they had encountered before. While inspecting the far edge of the bank, Paul noticed footprints pressed deep into the wet ground. Bare, massive impressions, the toes splayed slightly outward, each one easily twice the size of his boot. They led from the forest edge down toward the water, then curved back upstream before vanishing where the mud met the river. The prints were so deep that water had already begun filling them, reflecting the sky in dark pools. The men said nothing, only exchanged uneasy looks before deciding to check further downstream. An hour later, Tomas went missing. He had been walking the shallows, following a narrow path along the bank, when he simply failed to return. They called out, their voices swallowed by the forest. For 2 hours they searched before finding him upstream, half submerged at the water's edge, barefoot, his clothes soaked through and coated in fine mud. His fishing rod lay broken beside him. He did not respond to their voices. His eyes were open, but his expression was distant, unfocused, as though he had seen something incomprehensible. They carried him back to camp and wrapped him in blankets by the fire, but he remained silent, shivering despite the warmth. Around the area where they found him, the trees bore marks, branches bent sharply into spirals, others twisted as if by enormous hands. Long vertical gouges cut into the bark at chest height, exposing pale wood beneath. Some trees leaned unnaturally outward, their roots pulled from the soft soil. The ground was scarred by wide impressions leading toward the water, as if something heavy had dragged itself there and back. The same metallic scent lingered, thicker now, almost nauseating. When they packed up to leave, the forest seemed to press in on them. Every sound felt amplified. The rustle of leaves, the slap of water against the hull, the creak of the oars. Tomas sat motionless in the boat, his head tilted slightly toward the tree line as if listening. None of them spoke during the long paddleback. Local authorities later examined the site, though by then the river had risen from late summer rain. Most of the mud had smoothed over, erasing all visible prints. Only the pattern of the traps remained, the precise rows still intact, stones still placed inside as though carefully weighed. Investigators assumed human interference, though the remoteness of the area made it unlikely. The case was logged as disturbance, cause undetermined. Samples of the gouged bark revealed nothing except traces of moisture and organic residue consistent with skin oil, though from what source could not be determined. Tomas was taken to a local hospital. Physically, he was uninjured except for minor abrasions and deep bruising on both arms, as though gripped tightly. Psychiatrists described him as catatonic, unresponsive to verbal prompts, occasionally flinching when water was poured or when recordings of flowing streams were played near him. Over weeks, he began speaking in fragmented sentences, but he never described what he saw. When asked directly, he only repeated that he had been watched. In the following weeks, residents along that stretch of the river began reporting strange disturbances. At night, the forest would erupt with the sound of cracking branches, sharp, rhythmic snaps echoing across the water, followed by long, low exhalations that resembled the sound of an animal breathing heavily just beyond sight. No one ever saw the source. Campsites nearby were later found abandoned, with fire pits cold and supplies left behind. The air retained that same musky, metallic scent long after rain should have washed it away. By September, the wildlife had shifted. No birds sang near the bend. The beaver's dam downstream collapsed and was never rebuilt. Even bears, once common along that section of the river, seemed to avoid it. Locals began referring to that place as the Quiet Water, a name whispered more out of caution than folklore. Today, the site appears untouched again. The mud along the banks has hardened, smoothed by seasons of flood and thaw, and only faint traces of the old trap anchors remain. Yet those who fish the river say that when the wind drops and the water runs still, you can sometimes hear faint cracks echoing through the trees, slow, deliberate, and measured, like something vast shifting its weight in the forest just beyond the reach of light. On October 3, 2004, in the remote taiga east of Khabarovsk, a hunter named Viktor Sokolov drove his old Gaz-66 truck deep into the forest, where the dirt road narrowed into little more than a path between birch and pine. He had hunted alone for years, preferring the silence of late autumn when the forest turned pale and brittle under frost, when animal tracks stood out sharply against the frozen ground. His logbook showed that he intended to scout an area near the Bolshaya River for elk sign before the first snow, but no one heard from him again after that night. When he failed to return to his small cabin 2 days later, local rangers organized a search. They found his truck on a narrow clearing off the old logging road, parked neatly, doors closed, engine cold, headlights off. There were no tire marks indicating sudden braking or struggle, no signs of impact or accident. It looked as if he had simply stopped to rest. But what they found inside changed the tone of the search entirely. Victor sat slumped forward over the steering wheel, barefoot, his head tilted slightly as though frozen in mid-thought. His eyes were open wide, pale blue and glassy, fixed on the center of the cracked windshield. His mouth was partly open, and a thin line of dried blood traced down from his nostrils. His hands rested on his knees, palms upward, showing faint bruising as if they had been gripped tightly before he died. The seatbelt was snapped clean in two near the buckle, the fibers torn but not frayed, suggesting a single, violent strain. His rifle was placed across the dashboard, the barrel pointing outward through the windshield, positioned with deliberate symmetry. When the rangers opened the door, a thick, musky odor drifted out, heavy and organic, filling the cold air with a scent that clung to their clothes for hours afterward. It was not the smell of decay. Victor had been dead less than 24 hours, but something more primal, like wet fur mixed with iron. The ground behind the truck told the rest of the story. Pressed deep into the half-frozen soil were enormous footprints, bare, human-like, but far larger, spaced widely apart, each step sinking several centimeters into the hardened dirt. The prints led from the back of the truck toward the forest, where the trees stood dense and dark, then disappeared entirely among the shadows. Some impressions showed traces of water and fine debris, as if the creature had come directly from a nearby stream. Around the vehicle, branches had been bent outward in a wide semicircle, forming what looked like a rough perimeter, a kind of boundary. The bark on several trees bore long vertical gouges, reaching higher than any man could have made without a ladder. Victor's body was transported to Khabarovsk for autopsy. The report listed cardiac arrest under immediate cause of death, though the attending pathologist noted a sudden spike in adrenaline consistent with extreme terror. There were no defensive wounds, no external trauma beyond minor bruising on the forearms and shoulders. The soles of his feet were lacerated from exposure to gravel, suggesting he had left the vehicle at some point without shoes. Forensic technicians examined the truck in daylight. The windshield bore 3 deep vertical gouges, carved into the glass itself, each mark several inches long and evenly spaced. The surface around them was splintered inward, implying pressure from the outside rather than impact. No tool marks were found. The hood bore faint hand-shaped smears of mud and residue consistent with skin oils. The smell persisted even after the vehicle was aired out, clinging stubbornly to the upholstery. Search teams swept the forest perimeter for 2 days, tracing the footprints until they vanished into a marshy slope. No animal tracks accompanied them, no drag marks, and no secondary evidence of a human presence. The air remained still and unnaturally quiet. Even birds seemed absent, and the usual chatter of squirrels and insects was replaced by a faint, rhythmic rustling that came and went without wind. On the third night, 2 rangers camping near the site reported hearing low, drawn-out exhalations echoing from the trees beyond their tents. The sound was wet, heavy, and deliberate, like the breathing of something immense pacing slowly through the undergrowth. They said it came in intervals, 3 or 4 breaths followed by silence, then another sequence from a different direction. They left the following morning without finishing their search, citing exhaustion, though both refused to speak further about what they heard. When the case reached local authorities, the report concluded that Victor had suffered a sudden medical event, possibly induced by cold or stress. The strange details, the broken belt, the footprints, the scratches, were omitted from the official statement. The vehicle was towed back to town, cleaned, and later sold at auction. Yet according to the mechanic who handled it, the smell returned every time the cab was closed overnight, seeping from the vents despite repeated disinfection. Weeks later, hunters traveling the same road reported a silence unlike any they had experienced before. No animal sounds carried through the forest, and even the wind seemed to fade between the trees. They claimed that when engines were shut off, faint creaks and distant knocks echoed from deeper in the woods, as though something large was shifting its weight slowly, measuring the distance between them and the trees. Those who witnessed the scene described an overwhelming sense of dread and an instinct to leave immediately, even though no danger was visible. Even the most experienced among them refused to stay past dusk, convinced that whatever had stood by that truck might still be watching from the tree line. The northern face of the ridge had always been avoided by most local climbers, not because of its difficulty, but because of its isolation. The ascent began where the forest grew thickest, where the undergrowth muffled every sound and the air smelled of iron and sap. That morning, the climber, a 40-year-old mountaineer named Eric Laskin, started before dawn, carrying only the essentials: his harness, ropes, chalk, and a small pack with food and a radio that would soon lose all signal. He had climbed alone for years, confident and steady, drawn to the solitude of vertical stone, where the world narrowed to breath, grip, and focus. By late morning, he reached the base of the northern face, a sheer stretch of cold granite scarred with cracks and narrow ledges. The light filtered weakly through the tall spruces, and mist hung over the ground. As he prepared his gear, he noticed the soil nearby had been disturbed. When he looked closer, he froze. Pressed into the dark earth were footprints, bare, wide, and deep, each nearly twice the length of his own boot. The impressions were clear, toes spread, weight heavy, as if whatever had made them had stood there for some time. The stride between them suggested immense size, yet there were no other human signs. No tire tracks, no boot prints, no scattered tools or animal tracks. Only those enormous barefoot impressions leading toward the tree line and then looping back toward the cliff base, where they stopped abruptly, as if the being had vanished into the stone. He tried to rationalize it, perhaps erosion, a trick of light, or a prank. Yet the air around him carried a faint, musky odor, thick and unpleasant like damp fur left too long in the sun. The silence pressed in. Even the wind had stilled. With an uneasy breath, he turned to the wall and began to climb. The route was narrow and overgrown, with roots and moss filling the cracks that should have offered clean holds. Halfway up, he paused to rest on a small outcropping, his hands raw and his forearms burning. It was then that movement caught his eye on the ridge above, the dark line of something shifting between the trees. He squinted into the glare. A shape was there, massive and upright, its outline distorted by branches but unmistakably humanoid. For several seconds it remained motionless, as if observing him. Then slowly it turned and stepped out of sight, moving with a heavy, deliberate grace that made the treetops sway. Eric's pulse quickened. He tried to focus on the rock again, but the air had changed. The forest below seemed to have gone still in an unnatural way, as though the entire valley were waiting. He kept climbing, his breath shallow, glancing upward more often than his instincts allowed. The ridge loomed above him now, dark and uneven, and somewhere beyond it came a low sound, something between a breath and a growl, carried faintly by the wind. It lasted only a moment but left him trembling, unsure if he had truly heard it or only imagined it. When he finally reached a ledge wide enough to rest, he stopped to catch his breath. The ground there was littered with snapped branches arranged in crude arcs, not random but deliberate, as if laid out by hand. On the trees around the ledge were long vertical gouges, deep and uneven, far above human reach, cut into the bark as though by enormous claws or stones dragged across the surface. The marks were weathered but recent, the exposed wood still pale and raw. Eric felt a wave of nausea and crouched, scanning the forest below, half expecting movement. The smell returned, stronger now, thick and musky, mingled with the cold scent of stone and sap. He remembered the footprints at the base and realized they pointed directly toward where he now stood. For a long moment, he stayed motionless, his mind fixed on the silence that surrounded him, a silence that seemed alive, almost aware. He could not shake the feeling that something stood just beyond his sight, hidden by branches, watching. He forced himself to continue upward, climbing faster, his movements clumsy but urgent. Each gust of wind seemed to carry faint shifting noises from above, snaps, cracks, the soft thud of something heavy moving across earth. He reached the summit in early afternoon, exhausted and trembling, the forest below, vast and still. There were no signs of the figure, no footprints on the ridgetop, no scent except the lingering trace of damp leaves. Yet he could not escape the feeling that he had been followed all the way up. The descent took hours, each sound amplified by fear. When he finally returned to the base, the soil had changed. The enormous footprints were gone, erased somehow, but the ground bore fresh disturbances, small piles of stones arranged in a line, perfectly spaced, leading to the edge of the trees. He did not stop to examine them. He packed his gear in silence and left, glancing back only once to see the forest standing utterly still, as if nothing living breathed within it. Later, when he spoke of the climb, his account was calm but empty, stripped of exaggeration. He mentioned the footprints, the smell, the shadow that had paused above the ridge. Others dismissed it as exhaustion or altitude-induced confusion. But those who knew him found his change unsettling. He never climbed alone again. On his next expedition, months later, he chose routes far from that ridge, and he never once looked back toward the northern face that had watched him climb in silence. On September 8, 2021, a helicopter pilot named Lucas Miroff lifted off from the logging camp near the northern edge of the Kootenay Range in British Columbia, tasked with surveying unlogged ridges for potential timber operations. The day had begun clear, the air crisp and dry, the sunlight striking the treetops with sharp contrast. But by mid-morning, a sudden fog rolled in from the valleys, thick and persistent, swallowing ridges, riverbends, and even the tops of the tallest spruce. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the forest beneath the chopper became an abstract gray blur, the ground invisible, the slopes reduced to shadows that shifted beneath the hovering rotors. Lucas maintained a low hover, scanning the terrain, following the contours of the ridges, noting where he could see break lines and areas of dense undergrowth that would later be difficult for logging equipment to traverse. The rotor wash barely stirred the thick mist, producing only faint ripples in the fog as it passed over patches of moss and young saplings. As he adjusted his altitude to peer into a particularly steep ravine, a massive silhouette emerged through the haze, sudden and impossibly clear despite the fog. The figure was upright and enormous, far taller than any man, its shoulders broad, its outline slightly distorted by shifting mist, yet undeniable. It clutched a small animal in its enormous arms, the shape of the prey discernible only by the subtle movement of fur and limbs against the creature's chest. The creature moved with staggering precision and speed, weaving between trees without brushing the lower branches or disturbing the canopy, its path fluid, almost ghostly. Every motion was deliberate, measured, purposeful. Lucas's stomach tightened as he realized the rotor wash produced no disturbance beneath it. The undergrowth remained intact, yet enormous footprints began to appear in the mossy earth below. Each one pressed unnaturally deep, as if the forest itself had absorbed the weight of its steps. The pilot hovered in disbelief, trying to focus his eyes, scanning for anything that might explain what he saw. The creature paused at the crest of the ridge, its head turning slightly as it observed him through the mist. A musky, earthy odor drifted upward, faint at first but growing more distinct with each passing second, sharp and pungent, reminiscent of damp soil mixed with wet fur. The figure lingered only a moment, then vanished down the slope with impossible speed, the footprints continuing in an unbroken line until the forest swallowed them entirely, leaving no trail beyond where the trees grew thick and shadowed. Later, Rangers investigating the area arrived in teams on foot, guided by Lucas's flight path and GPS coordinates. They discovered the scene he had glimpsed from above. The Earth was flattened in wide, deliberate arcs, forming rough semicircles across the ridge. The trees had been bent outward at the base, some splintered, some stripped of bark along long, vertical lines. Deep gouges scored the trunks, some reaching more than 8 feet above the ground, far beyond the reach of a human. Claw marks marred the surface of several fallen logs, each one enormous, carved with an unmistakable, deliberate pressure. No trace of the small animal remained. No feathers, no fur, no blood. It was as though it had been removed entirely. The ground retained the impressions of the creature's feet for several days, until rainfall softened the moss and carried the shape away. Even weeks later, the flattened arcs and bent trees remained as reminders of something far larger than any human or known predator. Rangers noted that wildlife in the area behaved unusually following the incident. Birds avoided the ridges entirely, even on bright, clear days, and small mammals were notably absent from the forest floor. Wolves were heard only at the far edges of the survey zone, far from the flattened areas. The fog itself seemed to linger longer than normal, rolling in overnight and dissipating only mid-morning. And during early flights, Lucas and other pilots reported a persistent stillness in the air above those same ridges, an almost palpable pressure that made even experienced aviators uneasy. Locals, especially hunters and trappers familiar with the northern ranges, refused to enter the area for weeks after the reports. Many had long claimed that certain ridges held something unusual, something vast and intelligent that moved silently among the trees. Now, with the flattened arcs, gouged trees, and vanished prey, those stories gained renewed credibility. Some whispered that the figure's presence lingered even after the fog lifted, a watchful patience that seemed to settle over the forest, heavy and oppressive, waiting for the next intrusion. Lucas returned to the area 2 weeks later under clearer skies, attempting a second survey flight. He noted the previous footprint impressions had vanished entirely, erased by rain and wind, leaving the moss-covered slopes smooth, unbroken, and ordinary. Yet the oppressive silence remained, a weight on the ears and chest, as if the ridges themselves held their breath, anticipating some unseen observer. Even from a safe altitude, he could detect faint disturbances along the slope, subtle depressions in the moss, scuffed bark and broken branches that did not align with wind patterns or natural decay. Throughout the investigation, officials were reluctant to offer explanations beyond natural causes. The field notes mentioned large mammal activity, possibly bears, but none matched the scale or the unusual precision of the damage. The disappearance of the small animal was attributed vaguely to scavengers, though none were present when rangers walked the area. No photographs of the figure were ever taken, and no direct confrontation occurred. Only the footprint impressions, the flattened arc, the gouged trees, and the overwhelming musky odor remained as evident. Lucas never flew over the ridge again. He recounted the experience in his official report with careful neutrality, describing the footprint, the arc, the bent trees, and the odor, but leaving the figure itself as unidentified. Even months later, he could not shake the memory of the creature's fluid movement, its pause at the crest of the ridge, and the sense of conscious awareness he had felt while hovering above the fog. His instinct, honed over years of low-altitude surveying and wilderness flight, insisted that he had seen something beyond normal perception, something far larger and more intelligent than any known animal. The small northern ridges returned to quiet in the following month, as far as official reports could confirm, but those who surveyed the area or passed nearby described an oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over the forest like a living presence. The moss grew back over the arc, the trees slowly straightened, and the gouges weathered. Yet the memory of the encounter persisted in every footstep and glance, a lingering reminder that some things in the northern forests moved with precision, purpose, and intelligence, entirely beyond human expectation.